They thought silence meant weakness. They were wrong. The compound in northern Syria smelled like cordite and blood. Sergeant First Class Elena Thorne crouched behind a concrete barrier that wouldn't stop rifle rounds for long, her hands steady on an M4 carbine while the world tried to kill her. The firefight had been going for 3 hours and 40 minutes. Her team sergeant's face was open from forehead to jaw by fragmentation. 2 more teammates were bleeding in the corner, and she was the only one still capable of coordinating their extraction. The radio crackled against her ear. She keyed the mic with blood-slicked fingers, her voice carrying the kind of calm that only comes from accepting that death is present but not yet inevitable. Grid coordinates in military format. Brevity codes that existed in classified manuals most soldiers would never see. Close air support coordination for A-10 Warthogs that would need to put 30mm rounds danger close to American positions because the alternative was body bags. Her hands moved between the radio and the tourniquets, between calling fire missions and packing wounds with combat gauze. The building shook with each strike. Masonry dust filled the air like fog. But her breathing stayed controlled, her decisions stayed tactical, and when the helicopters finally came screaming in under covering fire, every single person in that building flew out alive. She didn't shake until 3 days later, and even then, only for a moment. That was Syria 2023. Classified mission, classified location, classified outcome. The kind of operation that generates medals with citations so redacted they're essentially blank paper. The kind of work that transforms young soldiers into old souls, that writes stories and scars instead of service records. 18 months later, she was standing at attention in a different kind of combat zone. Fort Moore, Georgia, November 2024. The morning air tasted like red clay and pine, that particular flavor of the American South, where the Army builds warriors out of civilians and sorts those who will survive from those who won't. 1st Battalion, 19th Infantry Regiment. The maneuver center of excellence, where the infantry is born and standards are supposedly absolute. Elena stood in formation at 0445, 28 years old, and carrying herself with a stillness that made people look twice without understanding why. She was unremarkable at first glance. 5'7" in boots, athletic build without being imposing. Dark hair secured in a regulation bun, brown eyes that focused on middle distance more than immediate surroundings. Her uniform was fresh issue creases, sharp boots still holding factory gloss. Nothing suggested capability beyond standard competence. Nothing advertised that beneath that uniform was a spearhead tattoo on her left rib cage marked with the number 1. The only physical evidence of selection into a unit so classified that even mentioning its existence violated operational security. A unit where 6 women had started the assessment cycle and only she had finished. 46 other soldiers stood in that formation. They had all been processed through reception together the previous day, issued identical equipment, given identical briefings. To anyone observing, she was just another body filling a training slot in Alpha Company's latest cycle. Just another sergeant recycling through after medical clearance, rebuilding herself after whatever injury had taken her offline. They had no idea what she'd survived to be standing there. Command Sergeant Major Garrett Blackwood walked the formation line like a predator assessing prey. 67 years old and built from 45 years of uncompromising military service, he moved with the kind of deliberate authority that comes from commanding men in actual combat. Korea DMZ in the 70s when tensions ran hot enough to kill, Grenada in 83, Panama in 89, Desert Storm in 91 where he'd earned his reputation as a ranger who understood that standards existed because relaxing them got people killed. His face was weathered stone. His eyes missed nothing. He'd been a drill sergeant, a ranger instructor, a tactical operations officer. He'd retired as a command sergeant major in 1998 and returned in 2015 as a senior tactical advisor because sitting still felt like dying slowly. He believed in absolutes, right and wrong, capable and incapable, earned and gifted. And when he stopped in front of Elena, his expression shifted into something colder than the November morning. He spoke loud enough for the entire platoon to hear his voice, carrying the flat authority of someone who'd buried too many soldiers to care about feelings. I've seen 40 years of political appointments in this army. Usually they get buried before they learn better. The silence was total. 46 soldiers held their breath. Elena maintained parade rest and stared at the wall behind him, her expression unchanged. She'd been called worse by men who were significantly better at threats and were now in graves their families would never visit. Blackwood continued his words surgical in their precision. Surnames don't stop bullets. Competence does. And this battalion has lost too many good soldiers because someone's daughter got a position she couldn't handle. His eyes stayed fixed on her name tape. Thorne, the surname of a legend. Lieutenant General Robert Thorne killed in Ramadi in 2006 when a vehicle-borne IED turned his MRAP into shrapnel and fire. Blackwood had served with men who'd served under Thorne. He knew the legend. Ranger Regiment. Special Forces. The kind of officer who led from the front and died the same way. And now his daughter was here recycling through training after what Blackwood assumed was a failure she was trying to hide behind medical paperwork and family connections. Elena said nothing. She'd learned silence from her father, who taught her that reputation without competence was fraud, that legacy without personal merit was theft, and that loud people usually compensated for inadequate knowledge. She'd learned it again in selection, where talking wasted energy better spent surviving. And she'd learned it finally in Syria, where the only communication that mattered was tactical and efficient. So she stood there and let Blackwood's assumptions wash over her like rain off stone. Because proving him wrong would require no words at all. Only time, only demonstration, only the kind of capability that announced itself through action rather than argument. The formation dispersed to begin processing. Elena moved with the group, her gait economical and deliberate. Private First Class Kira Dalton noticed. Dalton was 21 from Montana ranching country, former college athlete who'd enlisted because sitting in classrooms felt like suffocation. She had sharp eyes and the kind of pattern recognition that comes from growing up reading weather and livestock. And the way Elena moved didn't match the story Blackwood was telling. It was too efficient, too economical. The movement of someone operating from 10,000 hours of ingrained muscle memory rather than basic training repetition. Dalton followed it away without comment, but she was watching now. Specialist Wyatt Brenner noticed too. 26 years old, Iraq veteran from 2018 and 2019, recycling through training after a leg injury that had required surgical repair and medical discharge before reinstatement. He'd seen enough combat to recognize the signs in others. The way Elena assessed every room before entering. The way her eyes tracked exits in fields of fire. The unconscious tactical hand signals she made during formation movements. That wasn't basic training behavior. That was operational conditioning. Brenner said nothing either, but his interest was piqued. Something about Elena Thorne didn't align with the story everyone else was accepting. The barracks that night were standard-issue military discomfort. Bunks too narrow, air too warm, privacy non-existent. Elena lay awake in the darkness, touching the spearhead tattoo on her ribs through her shirt. A private ritual, a reminder of what she'd earned when the physical cost had been so high, she'd sometimes wondered if survival was worth the price. She remembered being 11 years old in Columbus, Georgia, watching her father run combatives drills with soldiers in their backyard. He'd pulled her aside afterward, taught her how to exploit leverage against superior strength, how to create angles that negated size advantage, how to end confrontations before they escalated. His voice had been quiet but absolute. Real fighting isn't cinematic, Elena. It's brutal, it's exhausting, and it's usually finished in seconds. Learn efficiency over flash. Learn to end things decisively. She remembered being 17 when the casualty notification officers came to the door. Their dress uniforms too perfect, their voices too practiced. Her mother's scream, the way the world had narrowed to a single point of unbearable clarity, her father was dead. Vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. Ramadi, a war she'd watched on television but never truly understood until it reached into her life and tore out her foundation. She'd enlisted 6 months after high school graduation. Her mother had signed the papers with hands that shook, knowing she couldn't stop her daughter from following the same path that had killed her husband, but hoping maybe Elena would choose something safer. Supply, transportation, anything but combat arms. Elena had chosen infantry, then Special Forces assessment, then the unit that didn't officially exist and never appeared on deployment rosters. The unit where the assessment cycle was 23 months of preparation, followed by selection, that broke 78% of candidates before day 4. where being the only woman in your class meant every evolution was scrutinized, every success attributed to lowered standards, and every failure magnified as proof that diversity mandates were endangering national security. She'd passed anyway, not because of her surname, because she'd shown up early to everything never quit during physical evolutions that left men vomiting in the dirt and demonstrated her father's ability to read terrain and assess tactical problems with the kind of intuitive clarity that couldn't be taught. She'd earned the spearhead tattoo. The number one below it marked her assessment cycle. Everyone who completed the pipeline received one. It was the only physical evidence of what she'd done, and it stayed hidden under every uniform she wore. Then came Syria, the operation that was supposed to be surgical. 96 hours of direct action, targeting a high-value network near the Turkish frontier. Clean, efficient, professional. Except their source was compromised. The target building was a deliberate trap. They'd infiltrated into overlapping kill zones in urban terrain, designed by someone who understood American small unit tactics intimately. The specific report of 762 by 39 impacting masonry. The way her team sergeant's voice stayed level on comms even as fragmentation opened his face. The metallic taste of adrenaline and dust. She'd pulled two wounded teammates into a structure offering minimal ballistic protection. Her hands had executed tactical combat casualty care, while her brain calculated fields of fire and likely enemy positions. She coordinated close air support with grid coordinates in brevity codes, while applying pressure to arterial bleeding. She'd made decisions that kept 4 people breathing until extraction arrived. 3 hours and 40 minutes. That's how long they'd held that building. That's how long she'd fought with one hand and treated casualties with the other. And when the helicopters finally came and they were airborne and safe, she'd looked at her hands and they weren't shaking. 22 months later, West Africa, another classified direct action, an IED during movement to target. The blast that tore through her left side, fracturing 3 ribs and collapsing her lung. The team medic who'd performed needle decompression in a moving vehicle. The emergency case evac. The surgeries. The 18 months of rehabilitation that followed. The Army had wanted to medically separate her. Temporary disability retirement. Honorable discharge with full benefits. Go home. Be grateful you survived. She'd fought them. Argued her case through medical boards and fitness assessments. Demonstrated that her lung capacity was returning, that her ribs had healed, that she could meet every physical standard required for operational duty. The Army's compromise had been this: complete a monitored return-to-duty program. Recycle through training in a controlled environment. Prove full capability across all metrics. Then they'd consider reassignment based on documented performance. She'd accepted because the alternative was separation and she wasn't finished. Her father had told her once that dying in combat was easier than living afterward without purpose. She understood that now in ways she hadn't at 17. So here she was, Fort Moore, Alpha Company, being publicly questioned by a command sergeant major who thought her surname was a free pass rather than a weight she'd spent her entire adult life learning to carry. Day 2 brought equipment layout. Blackwood conducted meticulous inspections with attention that identified violations others would overlook. When he reached Elena, he stopped and addressed the entire formation again, his voice carrying that same flat authority. Some soldiers receive opportunities based on surnames rather than capability. The Army sometimes grants exceptions it shouldn't for political reasons. Real infantrymen earn their positions through demonstrated performance rather than family connections. He looked directly at Elena throughout. The message was clear. The audience was intentional. This wasn't about correcting deficiencies. This was about public degradation, about establishing narrative, about ensuring that every soldier in that platoon understood his assessment: she didn't belong here. Elena maintained parade rest, stared at the wall behind him, expression unchanged. She'd been through assessment cycles designed to break candidates psychologically. She'd been through interrogation resistance training, where the objective was to maintain operational security under simulated capture. She'd held a building under sustained enemy fire while coordinating air support and treating casualties. This was just talking, and talking couldn't hurt her. But Blackwood had ensured every soldier heard it clearly. The seed was planted. Doubt was established. And in the communal environment of military training, where reputation and perception mattered and as much as performance, he just painted a target on her back. Kira Dalton watched from formation, her discomfort growing. She'd spoken with Elena during in-processing, noticed that she answered questions with minimal words but never seemed uncertain or defensive. There was something in Elena's bearing that suggested depth, like watching the surface of deep water and knowing there were currents below that remained invisible. That afternoon, a man arrived at the company headquarters. Older, early 70s, wearing civilian clothes but carrying himself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who'd spent a lifetime in uniform. His hair was silver, his face weathered by decades of sun and stress. His eyes were sharp and clear. Colonel Nathaniel Sterling, retired Special Forces Cold War veteran, former commander in Grenada and Panama and Desert Storm. He walked like someone who'd earned every step. And when he spotted Elena in formation preparing for afternoon physical training, something shifted in his expression. Recognition. And something deeper. Something that looked like old grief mixed with fierce pride. Sterling requested a private word. They met behind the company headquarters out of sight from the main formation. Sterling spoke first, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that didn't need volume to command respect. Your father was my executive officer in Mogadishu. 93. He saved my life twice in the same week. Once during the initial insertion when our helicopter took fire. Once during exfiltration when I took shrapnel and couldn't move, and he came back for me under direct enemy contact. Sterling's eyes held hers. I know what you've done since Elena. I know what you earned, and I know why you're here. Elena said nothing for a moment, processing. Then quietly, I need to prove this myself, sir. No interventions, no accommodations. If I can't return on my own merit, then I don't deserve to return. Sterling nodded slowly. I respect that. But you should know something about Command Sergeant Major Blackwood. He's old guard hardline, brilliant tactician, genuinely believes in standards. But certainty is his weakness. Once he forms an assessment, changing his mind requires overwhelming evidence. And he's already formed his assessment of you. Then he'll learn, Elena said simply, or he won't. Either way, I'm proving capability, not to him, to the 46 soldiers watching. They need to see what earned looks like. Sterling allowed himself a slight smile. Your father said almost exactly those words to me once. Different context. Same principle. He paused, then added, I'll observe, but I won't interfere unless absolutely necessary. This is your path. I'm just bearing witness. Thank you, sir, Elena said, and meant it, because having someone who knew the truth, who understood what she'd survived and what she was fighting to return to, made the isolation slightly less total. Sterling left. Elena returned to formation, and the pattern Blackwood had established continued. During physical training, he made references to soldiers who couldn't meet infantry standards, who were hiding behind accommodations and medical waivers. During classroom instruction on tactical operations, he mentioned personnel who'd gotten others killed because they weren't qualified for their assignments, always calibrated for plausible deniability, always specific enough that everyone identified the target. Other drill sergeants either remained silent or offered subtle agreement. Challenging a senior NCO with Blackwood's combat credentials and reputation would be career suicide for most of them. So the pattern reinforced itself. Public questioning became public certainty, became public consensus. By the end of week 1, most soldiers in Alpha Company had accepted the narrative Elena Thorne was skating on family connections. She'd failed somewhere, gotten injured because of her inadequacy, and was receiving special accommodation because of her father's reputation. Only Kira Dalton and Wyatt Brenner held reservations, and they kept them private. Week 2 brought the confidence course, an obstacle sequence designed to assess physical capability and mental resilience under controlled stress. Rope climbs and wall traverses and casualty drags and equipment carries. The kind of evolutions that separated those who could perform under fatigue from those who would break under operational tempo. Elena had been performing adequately but unremarkably, staying middle of the pack, not drawing attention, not standing out, because standing out meant scrutiny, and scrutiny meant questions, and questions led to revelations she wasn't ready to make. But Blackwood wasn't satisfied with adequate. He was looking for failure. for the breaking point that would validate his assessment and justify his public commentary. He pulled her aside in front of the platoon during a water break, his voice carrying across the training area. "Thorne, you'll be completing the final obstacle under my personal evaluation. Caving ladder climb, 30 feet, full fighting load, under 60 seconds. I want to see if you can actually meet infantry standards or if you've been coasting on paperwork." The challenge was clear. The setup was obvious. He was engineering a public evaluation, creating a documented opportunity to prove his narrative. He'd already told other drill sergeants that morning that he expected her to fail or request accommodation, that nepotism could only carry someone so far, and that he'd have justification for recommending her removal from the cycle. Elena looked at him with those neutral brown eyes that revealed nothing, and simply said, "Yes, Command Sergeant Major." What Blackwood didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Elena had climbed caving ladders in full kit with fractured ribs while teaching herself to breathe through partially collapsed lung tissue. That she'd done it during rehabilitation when the medical staff said it was impossible, when the pain made her vision narrow to tunnels, when every breath felt like broken glass in her chest. That she'd done it because quitting wasn't in her vocabulary, because her father had taught her that limitations were usually mental rather than physical, and because proving the medical board wrong required demonstrating capabilities they didn't believe were possible. So a caving ladder climb at Fort Moore in November with healthy ribs and full lung capacity, that wasn't a challenge, that was a formality. That night alone in the latrine after lights out, Elena sat on the floor and touched the spearhead tattoo on her ribcage through her shirt, the number 1 below it. The reminder that she'd earned access to rooms Blackwood would never enter, regardless of how many deployments he accumulated. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the specific anger that came from being evaluated by someone operating with catastrophically incomplete information. Blackwood thought this was about physical capability, about whether she could complete an obstacle course, about whether she could meet infantry standards. He thought he was defending institutional integrity against political corruption. He didn't understand she'd already exceeded standards that would have broken him. She'd held a building under sustained enemy contact for nearly 4 hours while coordinating fires and treating casualties. She'd completed an assessment cycle that required 23 months of preparation and broke 78% of candidates. She'd survived an IED blast that should have killed her and fought for 18 months to return to operational duty. This ladder climb, this was theater, performance for an audience that didn't know they were watching someone who'd already proven everything that mattered. She thought about Syria, about the weight of responsibility when 4 lives depended on her decisions, about the classified commendation that cited tactical leadership under sustained contact, but mentioned nothing about keeping people alive who would have died otherwise, about the Bronze Star with Valor device that sat in a box somewhere with a citation so redacted it was essentially meaningless to anyone without proper clearance. Blackwood wanted to prove she didn't deserve to be here. She'd already proven herself in environments where failure meant coming home in transfer cases. The distinction mattered fundamentally. She stood and examined herself in the mirror. 28 years old, scars from an IED that should have killed her. Starting over because the alternative was accepting she was finished and she wasn't ready to be finished. Her father had told her once that the hardest fights weren't against enemies. They were against people who should have known better, but chose certainty over understanding. Blackwood thought he was protecting standards. He was protecting his assumptions. And tomorrow those assumptions would begin to fracture. Tomorrow would matter. Not because she needed to prove anything to Blackwood. That wasn't the objective, but because the 46 soldiers witnessing this confrontation were going to receive an education about what actual capability looked like, about the difference between reputation and competence, about the fact that the quietest people in the room sometimes possess the most relevant experience. For her father, she thought. For everyone who'd earned their place through actions rather than words. For the teammates who'd bled in Syria and trusted her to bring them home. For the 18 months of rehabilitation where she'd rebuilt herself one painful repetition at a time. She touched the tattoo once more. Private ritual. Then returned to her bunk to prepare mentally for whatever test Blackwood had engineered. The confidence course would begin at 0600 in heat that was already oppressive despite November's approach. Blackwood had modified the final event without broader announcement, changing the caving ladder climb to require completion in 45 seconds, while wearing improved outer tactical vest with plates, Kevlar helmet, and weapon. Enhanced standard, he documented it. Necessary to properly assess capability under realistic combat load. Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Ashford, the battalion commander, had approved it with one condition that Blackwood hadn't mentioned to Elena. All drill sergeants would demonstrate the modified standard first. If Blackwood wanted to establish this as assessment criteria, it would apply to cadre initially. That was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, Elena lay in her bunk in the darkness, listening to the breathing of 46 other soldiers, and prepared herself for what was coming. Not with anxiety, with the cold clarity of someone who'd already survived worse and knew that survival was simply a matter of execution. She'd learned in Syria that panic was a choice, that clear thinking under pressure was a trained skill, that when the world was trying to kill you, emotion was a luxury you couldn't afford. So she breathed slowly, controlled her heart rate, visualized the evolution step by step, and let her mind settle into the operational calm that had kept her alive when chaos was absolute. Tomorrow, Garrett Blackwood would receive his first lesson in the difference between assumption and reality, the first crack in his certainty, the first glimpse that perhaps his assessment had been based on incomplete intelligence. But it would only be the first, because changing a man's mind when he'd spent 45 years building his worldview required more than one demonstration. It required overwhelming evidence, repeated proof, the kind of undeniable capability that made denial impossible. Elena was prepared to provide exactly that, not because she needed Blackwood's approval, but because 46 soldiers were watching, and they deserved to understand that capability didn't always announce itself, that strength sometimes lived in silence, and that the most dangerous assumption in combat or training was believing you understood everything about someone based on incomplete information. Tomorrow the demonstration would begin, and nothing would be the same afterward. The morning broke cold and clear, the kind of November day in Georgia where breath misted in the pre-dawn darkness and the red clay turned hard under boots. Fort Moore's confidence course sprawled across 15 acres of deliberately brutal terrain, each obstacle designed to test not just physical capability, but mental resilience, when fatigue made quitting seem reasonable. 47 soldiers assembled at 0600 in full kit. The modified standard Blackwood had engineered required improved outer tactical vest with ceramic plates front and back, Kevlar helmet, and M4 training rifle. 40 pounds of equipment on top of body weight. The caving ladder stretched 30 feet vertical rope and wood rungs that shifted under weight and required constant three-point contact to climb safely. Blackwood stood at the base, his presence carrying the weight of decades spent proving that standards mattered. That integrity made his assumptions about Elena more dangerous, because he genuinely believed he was protecting standards, defending the institution against erosion, preventing future casualties caused by political accommodation. His certainty wasn't malicious. It was worse than that. It was principled. Lieutenant Colonel Ashford stood nearby, arms crossed, watching. She'd approved this modified standard with specific conditions, and now she was here to ensure those conditions were met. Sterling stood further back, civilian clothes, making him nearly invisible among the uniformed cadre, but his eyes tracked everything with the attention of someone who'd spent 40 years assessing tactical situations. Blackwood addressed the formation, his voice carrying across the morning air with parade ground clarity. This evolution tests capability under combat load. In Korea and Panama, in Desert Storm, we didn't have the luxury of optimal conditions. We moved heavy, we moved fast, and we died. Today you'll demonstrate you can meet that standard. He paused, then added with deliberate emphasis, all evaluators will demonstrate first. If we're establishing this as assessment criteria, cadre leads by example. Blackwood approached the ladder, donned his IOTV with practiced efficiency, settled the Kevlar on his head, checked his rifle. At 67, his movements were economical rather than explosive efficiency replacing youthful power. He gripped the ladder and began climbing. His technique was textbook. 3 points of contact maintained throughout. Legs driving more than arms pulling. Breathing controlled and rhythmic. Each rung tested before committing full weight. The ladder swayed, but he adjusted his center of gravity smoothly. Decades of muscle memory compensating for age-reduced strength. He reached the top in 52 seconds. Slower than his prime, but impressive for a man approaching 70. He descended with the same controlled precision, his face showing effort but not distress. When his boots hit dirt, he wasn't even breathing hard. He turned to the formation. That's the standard. Everyone will meet it. 3 other drill sergeants completed the evolution. All finished between 48 and 55 seconds. All demonstrated the competence expected of infantry cadre. The message was clear. This wasn't impossible. This was simply the requirement. Then Blackwood called Elena forward first. Deliberate violation of normal rotation where soldiers went in roster order. But this wasn't about fairness. This was about public demonstration, about creating a documented moment where she either proved capability or revealed its absence. Elena stepped forward without hesitation. Her face remained neutral, but Kira Dalton, watching from formation, noticed something subtle. The way Elena's breathing had slowed. The way her hands moved with absolute precision donning her gear. The unconscious pre-mission ritual of someone who'd done this hundreds of times under conditions where mistakes had lethal consequences. Elena settled the IOTV on her shoulders, adjusted the straps with practiced efficiency, secured her Kevlar, performed a functions check on her rifle. Every movement economical. No wasted motion. The kind of efficiency that came from operating in environments where seconds mattered and fumbling got people killed. She approached the ladder, gripped it with hands that were steady as stone. And when Blackwood said, "Go," she moved. Her technique was different from his. Not stronger, but more efficient. She used her legs significantly more than her arms, treating the climb like a vertical ruck march rather than an upper body exercise. Her three-point contact was continuous but flowing, each movement transitioning smoothly into the next. Her breathing matched her movement in a rhythm that suggested this was trained behavior ingrained through repetition under duress. She'd learned this during assessment, refined it through operational training, applied it in situations where failure meant mission compromise and people died. A caving ladder at Fort Moore with healthy lungs and unbroken ribs. This was recovery day training. This was warm-up. She reached the top in 38 seconds. The silence that followed was absolute. Blackwood stared at his stopwatch like it had betrayed him. The other drill sergeants exchanged glances that communicated confusion and dawning alarm. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to struggle, supposed to request accommodation, supposed to validate the narrative. Instead, she hung there at the top, breathing controlled, looking down with those neutral brown eyes that communicated nothing except presence. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what was required. No drama, no celebration, simply competence demonstrated through action. She descended with the same controlled efficiency. When her boots touched ground, Blackwood's face had shifted from confidence to something approaching disbelief. He'd expected failure. He'd engineered conditions designed to expose inadequacy, and instead he'd just witnessed performance that exceeded his own by 14 seconds. His response was immediate escalation. 4-mile movement, fighting load, standard time 60 minutes, modified standard 45 minutes. Thorne goes first. Ashford's eyebrow raised slightly, but she didn't intervene. Sterling's expression remained neutral, but his eyes tracked Blackwood with the attention of someone watching a tactical situation develop. This wasn't evaluation anymore. This was something else. Something that looked like a man defending his worldview against evidence that threatened to collapse it. Elena accepted the new standard without comment. She'd run 4 miles in fighting load during rehabilitation, when every breath felt like broken glass. She'd done it during selection, when the only objective was surviving until the next evolution. She'd done it operationally when the alternative was getting left behind or compromising the mission, 45 minutes. That was aggressive but achievable. She settled into a pace that was sustainable, controlled her breathing, let her legs find their rhythm. Running wasn't about fighting the distance. It was about accepting it, managing it, turning discomfort into white noise and continuing to execute. She finished in 41 minutes. Blackwood had pushed hard to match her pace and completed in 43 minutes, his face showing significantly more strain than hers. The age gap was showing now. At 67, he could still perform at high levels, but recovery between evolutions was slower and accumulated fatigue hit harder. But he didn't stop. He cycled through the entire confidence course curriculum over the next 6 hours. Rope climbs where Elena matched standard with technique that suggested extensive prior training. Obstacle traverse, where her movement was fluid and economical. Casualty drag, where she employed proper body mechanics that minimized energy expenditure. Weapon assembly blindfolded, where her hands moved with the unconscious precision of someone who'd performed the task thousands of times. Every evolution she met or exceeded standard. Never by margins large enough to seem impossible, but consistently enough to demonstrate this wasn't luck or adrenaline. This was capability. Trained, refined, operationalized capability that couldn't be faked. Kira Dalton and Wyatt Brenner watched from formation between their own evolutions, and their earlier suspicions were crystallizing into certainty. Nobody performed like this without years of specialized training. Nobody moved with that kind of economy without extensive operational experience. The pieces didn't fit the story Blackwood was telling. Dalton leaned toward Brenner during a water break, her voice barely above a whisper. That's not normal. That's not even exceptional for someone with her background. That's something else entirely. Brenner nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Elena. I saw operators move like that in Iraq, not regular army. The guys who showed up without unit patches did their job and disappeared before anyone could ask questions. She's got that same, I don't know, that same presence. You think she's special operations? Dalton asked. I think Blackwood has no idea what he's testing, Brenner replied quietly. And I think we're about to watch him find out the hard way. By hour 7, Blackwood had exhausted standard evolutions and was searching for something that would reveal inadequacy. His certainty was fragmenting, but he couldn't accept what the evidence suggested. There had to be an explanation. Political accommodation. Lowered standards somewhere in her pipeline. Something that would validate his assessment and restore the worldview he'd built over 45 years. He announced the next test with barely concealed frustration. Combat lifesaver scenario. Timed casualty treatment. You'll have 5 minutes to manage a simulated patient with massive hemorrhage-compromised airway and tension pneumothorax, while coordinating evacuation. Standard tactical combat casualty care protocols apply. This was supposed to be the breaking point. Medical training at basic level was rudimentary, enough to keep someone alive until professional help arrived, but not sophisticated. He expected hesitation, maybe confusion, certainly gaps in her knowledge that would reveal she'd been pushed through training without mastering fundamentals. Elena approached the scenario with the same neutral expression she'd maintained all day. The simulated casualty was a training mannequin with realistic moulage, but the drill sergeant playing the victim was instructed to respond to questions and provide symptoms based on the scenario. She took 8 seconds to assess. Visual scan of the casualty, verbal questions about symptoms, rapid check of pulse and breathing. Then her hands moved. Hemorrhage control first. Combat priority. Stop the bleeding or everything else was irrelevant. She identified the simulated femoral artery injury, applied combat gauze, with proper wound packing technique, deep and methodical, then direct pressure with exactly the right force. Her hands talked through the steps in a teaching cadence that was unconscious habit. Pack deep, maintain pressure, don't remove once placed. 35 seconds. Textbook. Airway management next. She assessed for obstruction, determined a nasopharyngeal airway was indicated, selected the correct size based on patient height, and inserted it with proper technique. Then she added something that made 2 of the observing drill sergeants exchange startled glances. Contraindicated if basilar skull fracture signs present. Check for Battle's sign raccoon eyes hemotympanum before insertion. That wasn't basic training knowledge. That was advanced tactical medicine. The kind taught in special operations pipelines where medics needed to function independently without immediate physician oversight. 60 seconds total, still ahead of timeline. Tension pneumothorax. She identified absent breath sounds on the left side, noted tracheal deviation, and announced, needle decompression indicated. Her hands found the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line with anatomical precision. She mimed the needle insertion at proper angle and depth, explained the expected release of trapped air, then applied a chest seal with correct placement. 90 seconds. Her movements were controlled, efficient, professional. This wasn't someone who'd memorized procedures for a test. This was someone who'd performed these skills when consequences were real and patients actually died if you failed. Then came the critical error, the moment that revealed too much. She called for medevac over the training radio, and her format was perfect. 9-line medevac protocol with military grid reference system coordinates, brevity codes that existed in classified manuals, urgent surgical, 1 liter, no special equipment required. LZ assessment including wind direction and obstacles. Then she added almost conversationally, advise if escort required, we have friendlies in vicinity for CAS coordination. Close air support coordination. That phrase, that specific terminology. Basic training soldiers didn't learn 9-line medevac format. That was taught at advanced levels to personnel who would actually coordinate medical evacuations in combat zones. And CAS coordination language that existed in special operations doctrine in classified tactical procedures for units that operated in denied areas where evacuation required armed escort. Blackwood stood frozen, staring at her. The other drill sergeants had gone quiet. Something fundamental had just shifted. This wasn't basic competence. This wasn't even advanced training. This was operational experience at levels that required security clearances most soldiers never obtained. Sterling, watching from distance, allowed himself the slightest nod. The truth was beginning to emerge, not through revelation but through accumulated evidence that made denial increasingly difficult. Blackwood's voice carried strain when he spoke. Where did you learn that format, Sergeant? Elena looked at him with those neutral eyes. Training Command Sergeant Major. It wasn't technically a lie. She had learned it in training, just not the training Blackwood was imagining. Not basic combat training or advanced individual training. Training that came after selection into a unit so classified that even acknowledging its existence violated operational security. Training where 9-line medevac coordination was fundamental because you operated in locations where evacuation was complicated and CAS was often necessary for safe extraction. But she didn't elaborate, didn't defend, didn't explain, because the objective wasn't proving herself to Blackwood. It was demonstrating capability so clearly that explanation became unnecessary. Blackwood turned away his mind, working through implications he wasn't quite ready to accept. He walked to where Sterling stood, far enough from the formation that conversation wouldn't be overheard. You know something, Blackwood said flatly. Not a question. An accusation. That medical scenario, that medevac format, that's not basic training level. Sterling looked at him with eyes that had seen 40 years of classified operations and learned when silence was more effective than speech. No, it's not. What is she, Nate? Blackwood's voice carried frustration and the first hints of doubt. That performance today. Nobody moves like that without extensive prior training. Nobody uses terminology like that without operational experience. I can't tell you, Garrett, Sterling said quietly. That's not my information to share. But you'll find out. And when you do, you'll understand why your assumptions were dangerous. Blackwood's jaw tightened. 45 years of service had taught him to trust his assessment of soldiers to identify capability and inadequacy with near-perfect accuracy. His certainty about Elena had been absolute. Political appointment, family connections, inadequate capability hidden behind accommodations. But the evidence today contradicted everything he believed, and Sterling's carefully neutral responses suggested there was classified information he wasn't cleared to access. Information that would explain performance that shouldn't be possible given the story he'd constructed. That night alone in his office, Blackwood did what he should have done weeks earlier. He pulled Elena's personnel file. Not the basic roster information available to drill sergeants, but the administrative record that showed service history and awards. What he found confused him further. Her enlisted records showed basic combat training, advanced individual training, then a gap. Assignment to Fort Bragg with unit designation redacted. Then another gap. Assignment to classified theater with unit designation redacted. Then medical hold status. Then current assignment to 1st Battalion, 19th Infantry for capability assessment prior to reclassification. Her awards were listed, but details were absent. Purple Heart for injuries sustained during combat operations classified location. Bronze Star with Valor device for exceptionally valorous actions under enemy fire classified mission. The citations existed but were so heavily redacted they communicated almost nothing except that she'd been wounded and had performed actions significant enough to warrant recognition. Blackwood stared at those redactions. In 45 years, he'd seen sanitized records before. usually for personnel assigned to special mission units, Rangers, Special Forces, the units that operated in locations and conducted missions that remained classified for decades. The kind of assignments that required top-secret clearances and generated service records with more black bars than visible text. He pulled up her father's record for comparison. Lieutenant General Robert Thorne, Ranger Regiment, Special Forces, multiple combat deployments, killed in action, Ramadi 2006. And then Blackwood found something that made his stomach tighten. Robert Thorne's final assignment before his death, liaison officer to Joint Special Operations Command, the command that controlled the military's most sensitive counterterrorism operations. The pieces started connecting in ways Blackwood didn't want to acknowledge. Elena Thorne, daughter of a JSOC liaison officer. Service record with extensive redactions. Awards with classified citations. Medical hold following injuries in classified theater. Performance today that exceeded anything basic training could produce. Terminology and procedures that existed in special operations doctrine. But Blackwood's mind fought against the conclusion. Women in special operations were recent, controversial, political accommodation, his certainty told him. Lowered standards to meet diversity mandates. She couldn't have actually earned placement in elite units. That violated everything he believed about capability and standards. So instead of accepting evidence, he doubled down. Confirmation bias, the most dangerous form of certainty. He decided those awards were political, that her assignment to classified units was accommodation rather than merit, that her performance today was somehow fraudulent or exaggerated. Tomorrow he would design a final evaluation, something comprehensive enough to reveal the inadequacy he knew must exist somewhere beneath this facade of competence. Something that would validate his assessment and prove that his 45 years of experience hadn't failed him. He wrote up the evaluation parameters, combined assessment spanning multiple skills. Ruck March followed immediately by land navigation, followed by live fire qualification, followed by another casualty scenario. Fatigue-loaded evolution designed to find the breaking point when accumulated stress revealed true capability. He submitted it to Ashford for approval with justification that comprehensive assessment was necessary to properly evaluate someone returning from medical hold. She approved it with the same neutral expression that revealed nothing but her eyes tracked him with something that might have been concern. What Blackwood didn't know, what he couldn't know without the proper clearances, was that Elena had completed assessment cycles designed by psychologists and special operations veterans specifically to identify the 1% of candidates who could perform under conditions that broke everyone else. That she'd trained in environments where comprehensive evaluations lasted days, not hours, and the objective wasn't meeting standards but discovering personal limits under pressure that most humans never experienced. His final evaluation would be difficult. It would test her, but it wouldn't break her, because she'd already been broken and rebuilt in forges he'd never experienced. Meanwhile, Elena lay in her bunk that night and processed the day's events with the analytical clarity of someone trained to conduct after-action reviews. Blackwood had escalated exactly as predicted. His certainty was fragmenting, but not collapsing. He would need more evidence, more demonstration, more undeniable proof that his assumptions were catastrophically wrong. She touched the spearhead tattoo through her shirt. Private ritual, reminder of what she'd survived to be lying here. Syria felt distant now, like it had happened to someone else in another life. But the lessons remained. Clear thinking under pressure. Emotional control when chaos threatened. Technical competence demonstrated through action rather than explanation. Tomorrow would bring another test, and she would meet it the same way she'd met everything since that morning in Columbus, when she decided her father's death would either destroy her or forge her into something stronger. She'd chosen the latter, and that choice had carried her through selection, through operations, through an IED blast that should have killed her, through 18 months of rehabilitation. One more day of proving capability to a man who didn't want to believe the evidence. That was just another evolution, just another obstacle between current position and objective. And she'd learned long ago that obstacles were simply problems requiring solutions. You assessed them, you planned your approach, and you executed with the confidence that came from knowing you'd done harder things and survived. Across the barracks, Kira Dalton lay awake thinking about what she'd witnessed. The way Elena had moved through every evolution with economy, that suggested years of experience, the medical terminology that exceeded basic training by orders of magnitude, the 9-line medevac format that nobody in this formation should know. Dalton was young but not naive. She'd grown up reading people and situations on a Montana ranch where misreading weather or livestock could kill you. And everything about Elena suggested depth, capability, experience that didn't match the story everyone was accepting. Tomorrow she would watch more carefully. And if Blackwood pushed Elena to a breaking point, if this evaluation became harassment rather than assessment, Dalton would speak up. The cost to her career didn't matter as much as doing what was right. Her father had taught her that some things mattered more than advancement. Integrity, truth, standing up when standing up was hard. She didn't know yet that she wouldn't need to intervene, that events would overtake Blackwood's final evaluation in ways nobody could predict, that sometimes truth reveals itself not through careful planning, but through chaos that strips away at all pretense and forces capability into the open. Tomorrow would bring fire, real casualties, real emergency, and Elena would have to choose between maintaining her cover and saving lives, between proving herself through controlled demonstration and revealing everything in a moment of crisis that couldn't be managed or contained. But tonight, none of them knew that. Tonight, they lay in their bunks and prepared for evaluations and tests and obstacles. They prepared for a training exercise, for controlled assessment, for managed demonstration of capability. They didn't prepare for the moment when training became reality and reality demanded decisions that couldn't be unmade. The moment when Elena Thorne would stop being a recruit recycling through basic training and become something else entirely. Something that would make Blackwood's assumptions collapse into horrified understanding. That moment was coming, 16 hours away, and nothing would be the same afterward. December 28th arrived cold and clear, the kind of morning where frost painted the red clay white and breath hung visible in air that tasted like pine and cordite from nearby ranges. The final evaluation Blackwood had designed was comprehensive enough to satisfy his need for vindication and brutal enough to expose what he believed must be hidden inadequacy. Elena stood in formation at 0600 wearing full combat load IOTV with plates, Kevlar weapon, and assault pack loaded to standard 40 pounds. The evolution Blackwood outlined was straightforward in concept, but punishing in execution. 2-mile ruck march in 20 minutes. Immediate transition to live casualty medical scenario. 3-kilometer land navigation to designated checkpoint, then weapons qualification under time constraint. 4 phases designed to accumulate fatigue and reveal breaking points when soldiers could no longer maintain performance under stress. Blackwood addressed the formation with the flat authority that came from decades of putting soldiers through evolutions that sorted capable from incapable. Today's assessment measures sustained performance under realistic combat conditions. In actual operations, you don't get rest between tasks. You move heavy, you treat casualties, you navigate under pressure, and you engage targets accurately despite exhaustion. This evolution replicates that reality. He looked directly at Elena when he continued. Some soldiers perform adequately under controlled conditions, but fail when variables multiply. Today we identify who can actually operate when the mission demands it. Elena maintained her neutral expression. She'd completed evolutions significantly more demanding during selection, where days have blurred together and the only constant was pain and the decision to continue or quit. 2 miles in some medical scenarios. This was a warm-up compared to 18-hour land navigation movements through mountain terrain with no sleep and consequences for failure that included immediate dismissal from the program. The formation moved to the starting line. Elena checked her gear with practiced efficiency, adjusted straps, verified her weapon was unsafe. The pre-mission ritual of someone who'd done this enough times that it became unconscious. Kira Dalton positioned 3 soldiers away, watched those preparations with growing certainty that whatever story Blackwood believed about Elena, it was catastrophically incomplete. Blackwood gave the signal. Elena and 5 other soldiers began the 2-mile movement, boots hitting dirt in rhythms that would either sustain or break over the next 20 minutes. Elena settled into a pace that was aggressive but sustainable. Her breathing controlled her stride, economical. Running under load wasn't about fighting the weight. It was about accepting it, distributing it properly, and maintaining form when fatigue made every step feel heavier than the last. 1,500 meters away on Bravo Range, where another company was conducting IED defeat training, something went catastrophically wrong. The device was supposed to be inert, training aid, demonstration model showing blast patterns and fragmentation effects without actual explosive content. But somewhere in the supply chain, someone had made an error. The device that arrived was live. Minimal explosive content, but enough. Enough to turn training into tragedy when the instructor activated it at the wrong moment with 3 soldiers standing too close. The explosion wasn't massive, but it was real. Wrong sound, too sharp, too violent. Black smoke that carried the chemical signature of actual detonation rather than pyrotechnics. And then the screaming started. Elena was at mile 1.5 when she heard it. 400 meters away, but unmistakable. She'd heard that sound before. Syria, West Africa. The specific report of uncontrolled detonation followed by human voices making sounds that meant catastrophic trauma. Her stride faltered for half a second as her brain processed threat assessment, distance calculation, and probability of mass casualty. The radio on her kit erupted with traffic. Ceasefire, ceasefire, Bravo Range, multiple casualties, medic to Bravo Range immediately. Blackwood's voice cut through, directed at Elena and the other soldiers in her group. Continue your evolution. This is not your concern. Medical personnel are responding. Elena's mind was already running calculations. 400 meters. 90 seconds at sprint with full kit. Radio traffic indicated multiple casualties with severe trauma. Drill sergeants at that range were basic combat lifesaver qualified, but not advanced. If injuries were complex, if there was arterial hemorrhage or a tension pneumothorax, or traumatic amputation, response time mattered absolutely. Minutes meant the difference between survival and bleeding out. She heard another transmission. We have traumatic amputation. Jesus Christ, his leg is gone. Somebody help. The voice carried panic, untrained panic. The sound of someone watching a soldier die and not knowing how to stop it. Elena's hands moved before conscious decision was complete. She dropped her ruck to reduce weight, verified her weapon was safe, and started running toward the smoke. Blackwood's voice on the radio was sharp with command authority. Thorne, you will continue your designated evolution. That is a direct order. Elena kept running, because the mission had never been passing Blackwood's evaluation. The mission had always been saving lives when lives needed saving. That was what operators did. That was what she'd trained for through years of selection and operations and rehabilitation. You didn't ignore casualties because completing an obstacle course was more convenient. Her sprint covered 400 meters in 92 seconds despite full combat load. She burst onto Bravo Range and the scene was exactly as bad as the radio traffic suggested. 3 casualties on the ground. 2 drill sergeants trying to help, but clearly overwhelmed. Blood everywhere, too much blood, the ground already saturated. The specific metallic smell of mass trauma, copper and iron, and human tissue exposed to air. Casualty alpha was catastrophic. Traumatic amputation, right leg below the knee. The limbs simply gone and arterial blood pumping from the stump in rhythmic spurts that meant he had maybe 3 minutes before hypovolemic shock became irreversible. He was screaming hands trying to grab the injury, eyes wide with animal terror. Casualty Bravo had shrapnel penetration, chest and abdomen, his breathing rapid and shallow with absent breath, sounds on the left side. Tension pneumothorax developing. Maybe 5 minutes before the trapped air collapsed his cardiovascular system completely. Casualty. Charlie was conscious but disoriented, facial trauma from blast overpressure, probably concussion, blood running from nose and ears. Least critical but still requiring management. The 2 drill sergeants were frozen in that specific paralysis that comes from watching something beyond your training when what you know isn't adequate and people are dying and you don't know how to stop it. Elena's voice cut through the chaos with command authority that came from real operations, from making decisions when seconds mattered and hesitation killed people. Not the voice of a recruit, the voice of an operator who'd done this when consequences were absolute. You come, she pointed at casualty Charlie. Direct pressure on your face. Sit down against that barrier. Do not move unless I tell you. To the first drill sergeant, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made compliance automatic. Call Medevac right now. I'm giving you the 9 line. Get your notebook and write exactly what I say. To the second drill sergeant, get the aid bag, combat gauze, tourniquets for kit. Move. Then she dropped to Casualty Alpha because bleeding control was absolute priority. Everything else was irrelevant if he bled out in the next 2 minutes. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd done this when the casualties were her teammates and failure meant going home and telling families that their soldier died because she wasn't good enough. Tourniquet application. High and tight above the amputation. She placed it mid-thigh, tightened the windlass until arterial flow stopped, completely checked for distal pulse to verify proper application, then tightened 2 more turns to account for tissue swelling. Time check on her watch 0847. She wrote it on the tourniquet with marker from the aid bag because tracking application time was critical for surgical teams. Combat gauze to the stump, packing deep into the wound cavity, filling space where tissue should be, creating pressure that supplemented the tourniquet. Her hands were blood-covered within seconds, but steady as stone. She'd done this in Syria while coordinating close air support. She'd trained for this through hundreds of iterations until the procedure was unconscious. To the casualty, her voice calm and absolute. Stay with me. Focus on my voice. You're going home. Your family will see you again. I've got you. Tell me your name. Mitchell, the soldier gasped, his grip on her arm desperate and tight. Private Mitchell, am I dying? No, Elena said with absolute certainty. You're injured, but you're not dying. I need you to stay conscious. Keep talking to me. Tell me about your family. She was already moving to Casualty Bravo while maintaining verbal contact with Mitchell. Assessment took 5 seconds. Visual inspection, percussion of chest, wall, listening for breath, sounds. Absent on the left. Tracheal deviation toward the right. Jugular vein distension. The classic triad of tension, pneumothorax. To the drill sergeant with the aid bag. I need your knife, right now. Don't question, just hand it over. The blade came to her hand. She identified landmarks with anatomical precision that came from advanced tactical medicine training. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular, line well. She palpated the exact location, positioned the 14-gauge catheter at proper angle, and performed needle decompression with the confidence of someone who'd done this procedure when getting it wrong meant watching a teammate die. The hiss of escaping air was immediate and unmistakable. Trapped pressure released, the patient's breathing improved visibly, his color shifting from gray toward normal within seconds. She applied a vented chest seal, then established IV access in his right antecubital vein. 18-gauge catheter saline wide open to support blood pressure that would drop as his body compensated for trauma. While her hands worked, her voice directed the drill sergeant on radio procedures. Write this down exactly. Line 1 grid November, Charlie 847-23651. Line 2 call sign Archer 6, frequency 42, decimal 50. Line 3, 2 urgent surgical 1 priority. Line 4, no special equipment required. Line 5, 2-liter 1 ambulatory. Line 6 cold LZ, secure minimal threat. Line 7 marked with purple smoke. Line 8 nationality US. Line 9 terrain flat, no obstacles, wind from north 6 knots. She paused, then added the detail that would save critical minutes for the flight medics. Advise medical crew category alpha hemorrhage with tourniquet applied at 0847 tension pneumothorax, treated with needle decompression, and chest seal IV established with saline wide open. Patient 2 is stable for transport. Patient 3 has suspected concussion, but ambulatory. The drill sergeant stared at her, transmitting the information mechanically, but his face showing comprehension that something fundamental about this situation didn't match reality. That 9-line format was perfect. That medical terminology was advanced. That casualty treatment was operator-level sophisticated. Blackwood arrived at a sprint, his 67-year-old legs carrying him 400 meters in time that would have been impressive for a soldier half his age. He stopped at the edge of the scene and simply watched. Watched Elena's hands moving with absolute precision. Watched her coordinate treatment and evacuation simultaneously. Watched her manage 3 casualties with the kind of tactical efficiency that came from training most soldiers never received. Sterling arrived 30 seconds behind Blackwood, breathing hard but eyes immediately cataloging everything. The tourniquet placement, the needle decompression site, the IV access, the organized chaos of effective trauma management. He'd seen this before in special operations medical training in combat, where operators needed to function as their own medics because help wasn't coming fast enough. More personnel were arriving now. 30 soldiers from various formations drawn by the explosion and radio traffic. They formed a perimeter, watching Elena work, seeing something that didn't match any story they'd been told about her. This wasn't basic combat lifesaver competence. This was something else entirely. The Black Hawk arrived 8 minutes after the initial call. Combat medical evacuation helicopter with Air Force pararescue personnel, the most highly trained medical specialists in the military. The senior PJ jumped out and moved immediately to assess the casualties, his experienced eyes taking in the scene within seconds. He looked at the tourniquet, checked the time notation, verified proper placement, looked at the needle decompression site, assessed the chest, seal-checked IV placement and flow rate. Then he turned to Elena, his face showing professional recognition of competent work. Outstanding trauma management, Sergeant. Textbook special operations medicine. That tourniquet placement saved his life. The needle D was perfectly placed. Where'd you train? Elena stood, blood covering her hands, and uniform her face neutral. Here and there. The PJ's eyes narrowed slightly, recognition flickering. He'd worked with special mission units enough to know that response. That specific deflection that meant classified training and operational experience that couldn't be discussed. He looked at her more carefully, noted the economy of movement, the controlled breathing, despite obvious exertion, the eyes that tracked threats and assessed situations with automatic precision. Here and there, he repeated quietly, then nodded. Roger that. You saved 2 lives today, maybe 3. That's solid work. The Black Hawk lifted off 3 minutes later, casualties secured, and stable medical crew working to maintain what Elena had established. The sound of rotors faded into distance, and silence settled over Bravo Range except for the ringing in everyone's ears from the explosion. That's when the black SUV arrived. Government plates, 2 occupants, Lieutenant Colonel Victoria Ashford in her duty uniform, command presence absolute, and a man in civilian clothes carrying himself with the specific bearing of someone from Army Special Operations Command. No unit insignia, no name tape, just presence that communicated authority. Ashford walked directly to Blackwood, her face stern but controlled. Command Sergeant Major, private conversation. Now. They moved 20 meters away, far enough that the formation couldn't hear details, but close enough that body language communicated everything. Ashford spoke quietly but with emphasis that made Blackwood's face drain of color. The USASOC liaison joined them, added his own quiet statements, and Blackwood's certainty finally collapsed into horrified comprehension. Sterling approached the group, old colleague joining old colleagues for a conversation 45 years in the making. When he spoke, his voice carried weight that transcended rank or position. Weight that came from having survived enough to understand how dangerous assumptions could be. Garrett, Sterling said quietly. Robert Thorne was my executive officer in Mogadishu. 93. He saved my life twice. Best tactical officer I ever commanded. Brilliant soldier. Better man. Blackwood looked at Sterling with eyes that were beginning to understand the magnitude of his error. Sterling continued, his voice still quiet but absolutely clear. His daughter Elena enlisted 6 months after he was killed. Made it through basic training and advanced individual training without incident. Volunteered for Special Forces assessment at 23. Passed first attempt. Then she did something most men can't do, and most women never get the chance to attempt. Sterling nodded toward the USASOC liaison, who pulled out a tablet and showed Blackwood a personnel file. The real one, still heavily redacted but with enough visible to paint the picture. Combat Applications Group, Assessment Completion 2014. The unit that didn't officially exist. The unit that conducted the military's most sensitive counterterrorism operations in denied areas where failure meant international incident and success meant silence. Selection process that took 23 months of preparation and broke 78% of candidates before day 4. Operational rotations, 3 of them. Syria 2023, where she'd coordinated her team's survival through sustained enemy contact lasting 3 hours and 40 minutes, treated 4 casualties under fire, called in close air support. danger close to friendly positions, and ensured zero killed in action when the probability of total loss was near certainty. West Africa 23, where an IED had fractured 3 ribs and collapsed her lung, and she'd continued mission prosecution until medical evacuation because operators didn't quit until the objective was secured or they were physically incapable of continuing. Bronze Star with Valor device. The citation was still mostly redacted, but fragments were visible. Exceptionally valorous actions under sustained enemy fire. Tactical leadership preventing friendly casualties. Coordinated fire support in denied area. Demonstrated extraordinary courage under circumstances of great personal risk. Purple Heart. Severe injuries sustained during combat operations. Continued mission despite catastrophic trauma. Ensured team survival through decisive action while critically wounded. 18 months of medical rehabilitation. Fighting the medical board that wanted to separate her. Arguing her case through fitness assessments and capability demonstrations. Proving she could return to operational status when conventional wisdom said her injuries were career-ending. And finally, the current assignment monitored return-to-duty assessment, complete comprehensive evaluation and controlled training environment to verify full capability restoration across all metrics, then reactivation to previous unit based on documented performance. Blackwood stared at that file like it was written in a language he didn't understand. 3 weeks of publicly degrading someone whose service record he'd never been cleared to access. 3 weeks of assuming nepotism when she'd earned everything through demonstrated capability under conditions he'd never face. 3 weeks of questioning her competence when she operated at echelons most soldiers couldn't reach, regardless of training or preparation. "I was protecting standards," Blackwood said, his voice barely audible. Not defensive, just trying to understand how he'd been so catastrophically wrong. "You were protecting your assumptions," Sterling replied quietly. "There's a difference, Garrett. Standards haven't dropped. They've evolved. And Elena Thorne meets them regardless of what you believed was possible." Ashford ordered the formation assembled. All 47 soldiers plus cadre, everyone who'd been on the training area that morning. She stood before them with command presence that made even senior NCOs stand straighter. Sergeant First Class Elena Thorne served with distinction in the United States Army's premier Special Operations Unit. Ashford stated, her voice carrying across the formation with absolute clarity. She was placed on temporary disability retirement following severe combat injuries sustained during classified operations in 223. She paused, letting that information penetrate. Soldiers exchanged glances, pieces clicking into place, understanding beginning to dawn. She has been completing medical board assessment requirements for reactivation to full operational duty. Her performance over the past 3 weeks, and especially her actions today, have exceeded all benchmarks. She is cleared for return to her previous assignment, effective immediately. Ashford's eyes swept the formation. Sergeant Thorne holds the Bronze Star Medal with Valor device for actions under enemy fire. She holds the Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. The specifics of both remain classified and will remain classified. What you need to understand is that she earned her position through blood sacrifice and demonstrated capability, not through family connections, not through political accommodation, through performance under conditions most of you will never experience. She looked at Blackwood. Some lessons require humility to learn. I expect everyone here to learn this one. Assumptions are tactically dangerous. Capability doesn't always announce itself. And the quietest warriors sometimes possess the most relevant experience. The formation was dismissed. Soldiers dispersed, slowly processing what they'd learned, understanding that they'd witnessed something significant, that the story they'd accepted about Elena was incomplete at best and fraudulent at worst, that Blackwood's certainty had been assumption rather than knowledge. Blackwood approached Elena where she stood removing her blood-soaked gear. He struggled for words, 45 years of confidence, collapsing into uncertainty about what to say to someone he'd spent 3 weeks publicly degrading. "Sergeant Thorne," he began, then stopped, started again. "I was wrong about everything. Completely catastrophically wrong. I apologize." Elena looked at him with those neutral brown eyes that revealed nothing. She pulled off her blood-covered gloves, deliberately dropped them in the appropriate disposal container, then spoke for the first time with something other than neutral acknowledgement. You assumed weakness because you couldn't see beyond your own experience, Command Sergeant Major. In combat, bad intelligence gets people killed. Today, your assumptions almost did exactly that. Blackwood flinched but didn't look away. I thought I was protecting standards, defending everything I believed. Standards haven't dropped, Elena said quietly but with absolute certainty. They've evolved. Some of us meet them regardless of what you believe is possible. My father told me once that loud people compensate for inadequate knowledge. Real operators stay quiet and let their actions speak. She paused, then added, "You served with my father briefly. Desert Storm staging 1990. He mentioned you once, said you were a good ranger. Tough, competent, but certain about things that deserved more questioning." Blackwood's eyes widened slightly. Robert Thorne had assessed him 34 years ago and identified the same weakness Sterling had just exposed. Certainty without sufficient evidence. Assumptions that hardened into conviction without proper verification. "I don't know what to say," Blackwood admitted. "Say nothing," Elena replied. "Remember this. Teach better. Help the next generation understand that capability manifests in forms they might not recognize. That's how you honor the standards you think you were protecting." She didn't forgive him explicitly, didn't destroy him either, just provided the lesson and left him to process it. Then she walked away with quiet professionalism, leaving Blackwood standing alone with the wreckage of his certainty. Sterling approached Elena as she prepared to leave, his face showing something that might have been pride mixed with old grief. "Your father would be proud, not because of what you've done, because of who you've become." "Thank you for watching over me, sir," Elena said quietly, "even when I said I didn't want it." "I wasn't watching over you," Sterling replied. "I was bearing witness. There's a difference." He reached into his jacket and pulled out something wrapped in cloth, opened it carefully. A Ranger tab faded and worn, the black and gold thread still visible but aged by decades. "Your father's, from his first deployment with Regiment 1989. He gave this to me before Mogadishu, said if anything happened to him, I should give it to you when you'd earned your own path, when you'd proven you didn't need his name because you'd built your own reputation." Elena took it, and for the first time in 3 weeks, her neutral expression cracked. Tears formed but didn't fall. She held the tab like it was made of something more precious than fabric and thread. Because it was. It was legacy. Real legacy. Not inherited, but recognized. Not given, but earned. "You've earned it 10 times over," Sterling continued quietly. "He knew you would. He just knew you'd do it your own way in your own time through your own choices. That's what made him proudest when he talked about you. Not that you might follow his path, that you'd forge your own." "I miss him," Elena said, voice barely above whisper. "Every day." "He's with you," Sterling replied. "In every decision you make, every life you save. That's the real legacy. Not the tab, not the rank he achieved. The principles he lived by and passed to you. That's what survives." Kira Dalton approached hesitantly, wanting to speak but uncertain what to say. Elena noticed and turned toward her, the neutral expression returning but something warmer underneath. "I'm sorry I didn't speak up earlier," Dalton said. "I should have questioned what was happening. I should have said something." "Nothing to apologize for," Elena replied. "The lesson wasn't about defending me. It was about learning to trust capability, even when it looks different than expected. You'll remember this. And next time when you see someone being underestimated, you'll know better than to accept assumptions without evidence." "What you did today," Dalton said quietly, "those soldiers would have died without you." "That's the work," Elena said simply. "Training so when it's real muscle memory takes over. You'll do the same someday if you stay focused and remember that competence matters more than comfort." She handed Dalton a piece of paper with an email address. "If you ever need advice, combat medicine, tactical thinking, or dealing with people who confuse familiarity with standards, reach out." Wyatt Brenner waited until Dalton left before approaching. He didn't say much, just looked at Elena with the understanding that comes from having been downrange and recognizing others who'd been there too. "Iraq, 2018, he said quietly. "Fallujah. My convoy got hit. CAS came in, saved us. I heard rumors after about the unit that coordinated those strikes, operators with spearhead tattoos. Elena didn't confirm, but her slight nod was acknowledgement enough. Thank you, Brenner said, for everything you've done, everything you'll keep doing that we'll never know about. Stay safe, Elena replied. Take care of the new ones. They're why we do this. 4 days later, Blackwood sat alone in his office on New Year's Eve processing what he'd learned. He didn't request transfer, didn't seek reassignment to avoid embarrassment. He stayed because running from mistakes was cowardice, and whatever else he might be, he wasn't a coward. He wrote a letter to Elena delivered through Sterling because he didn't have her contact information. Apology, acknowledgement, lesson learned. I spent 45 years believing I knew what standards meant. You taught me I'd confuse standards with familiarity. I was wrong. You earned everything. I'm sorry. And I'm better for having learned this. Sterling visited him that afternoon, found him staring at that letter before sending it. You learned something 45 years didn't teach you, Garrett. That's called growth. Most people never get that far. How do I fix this? Blackwood asked. How do I teach better? You just did, Sterling replied. By admitting you were wrong, by learning from it, by understanding that certainty without evidence is dangerous. That's what you pass to the next generation. Not that you never made mistakes, that you recognized them and grew. Elena reported to Fort Liberty 1 week later. North Carolina, home base. The team room where operators prepared for missions that would never appear in press releases or official records. Her teammates welcomed her back with quiet professionalism. Fist bumps, nods, no speeches, because operators didn't need words to communicate what mattered. Medical board clear, her team sergeant asked. Fully operational, Elena confirmed. Good, we've got work. That was all. That was enough. She was back. She was ready. She'd proven what needed proving. The rest was just mission preparation. The night before her first operation back, Elena sat alone in the team room at 0400, preparing her gear. Methodical ritual. Every item checked and rechecked. Every piece of equipment verified. The pre-mission discipline that kept operators alive when margins were thin. She touched the spearhead tattoo through her shirt. Didn't hurt anymore. Just a reminder of what she'd earned. Of the selection cycle that had broken 78% of candidates. Of the operations where she'd proven capability under conditions most humans never experienced. Of the 18 months fighting to return when conventional wisdom said she was finished. Her phone showed 3 emails. Kira Dalton. Thank you for teaching me that courage comes in silence and strength needs no announcement. Garrett Blackwood. I was wrong. Thank you for the education. I'm sorry, and I'm better for it. Nathaniel Sterling. Your father's legacy lives in you, but yours is just beginning. Proud to have witnessed both. Elena smiled briefly, then focused on the mission brief. Classified target, high-value network, Syria border region, familiar territory, complex operation requiring precision and discipline, and the kind of tactical excellence that only came from years of training and operational experience. Her team filed in, quiet professionals, ready to work. The brief began, and she absorbed every detail with the focus of someone who understood that lives depended on getting this right, that the mission mattered, that the work continued regardless of who believed in her or doubted her. Because ultimately, that's what operators did. They ignored the noise and focused on the work. They proved capability through action rather than argument. They stayed quiet and let results speak. They understood that legacy wasn't inherited, it was built. One decision at a time, one mission at a time, one moment of choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. Elena Thorne had honored her father's memory, not by trading on his name, but by building her own path through the same uncompromising standards he'd taught her. Proven through blood and sacrifice when circumstances demanded it. And somewhere in whatever place warriors go, when their watch is done, Robert Thorne was watching his daughter become everything he'd hoped. The mission brief continued. The work waited. The warrior was home. In the end, the quietest warrior had taught the loudest lesson. True strength announces itself through action, not words. Legacy is built through choices made when no one is watching and proven when everyone is. Elena had demonstrated that standards evolve without dropping, and warriors earn their place through capability, not assumptions. The work continued, and that was enough.